Hi, and welcome to the HearSay podcast.
Your guide to understanding digital accessibility.
We connect the dots between accessibility policy,
practice,
and progress, so you can build a digital world
that works for everyone.
This is HearSay.
Hi everyone, welcome to the HearSay podcast. I'm Matthew Freeman, Director of EU Sales at AudioEye, and today we're going to be talking about something that's just round the corner. It's the European Accessibility Act. And if you work in the EU or you have customers that are based in the EU, then this is something you need to get on the radar. So look, let's start with the basics, right? What is EAA? Well, the EAA is a pretty large piece of legislation designed to make sure that all digital products and services provide accessible content and experiences to users with disabilities across the European Union. So think websites, applications, e-ticketing, banking services. Ultimately, the goal is to provide equal access to all users, but particularly those with disabilities. So now the big question, who needs to comply with the new regulation? Well, we'll break it down further during the show because it's not just EU companies, right, that have to comply. If your business is selling goods or services digitally into the EU, then the chances are that this will apply to you. And here's the biggest thing to be aware of. The deadline is just around the corner. So on the day of recording this, we are 39 days away from the deadline, which is the June 28th, 2025. And after that, organizations that don't meet the requirements could face a variety of penalties depending on how each EU member state is likely to enforce the new regulation. So ultimately, if you've been putting off improving digital accessibility, this is your wake-up call today. So what we're going to do is dive further into the EAA, what you need to be doing right now to avoid scrambling at the last minute. And to help me do that, I've brought on someone who's a bit of a legend in the space, Susanna Laurin. Susanna is the Managing Director and Chair of the Funka Foundation, who served as the expert to the European Commission and member states during the creation of the Web Accessibility Directive. She currently advises organizations on the EAA and its implications and is a representative in the IAP, so the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. Welcome, Suzanne. I'm over the moon to have you here.
Thanks for having me. And don't mention too much that I'm a dinosaur in this. I'm trying to to stay up to date. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think to kick things off, it would be really good if we could just give a little bit of background. You've been so heavily involved in terms of, influencing the sort of European Accessibility Act. I'd love to just learn a little bit more in terms of your involvement and what that's looked like.
So, there's a lot of people involved in getting legislation in place, so I don't want to put myself in too much of a kind of a limelight here, but I have been working with the Commission and the Parliament for many years, both in the previous legislation, the Web Accessibility Directive, and also now with the Accessibility Act. And I'm kind of wearing a couple of different hats since I'm doing research on user-centric design, and I'm also heavily involved in standards and the European standards under the mandate for this legislation and also the current one. And I've been in the standardization field also for more than 20 years. So, and also supporting from the policy perspective, both at the European level and also in the member states. So if anything goes wrong, it's usually my fault. But if anything goes well, then there's usually somebody else taking the...
Well, that's a huge amount of experience, right? And I think, look, it's really nice to have you here. I think the listeners will really learn a lot in terms of to sort of leverage that experience, but hopefully to sort of talk a little bit more in terms of to leverage that to go and make some sort of decisions in terms of how they can make better and more accessible experiences. So I think I'd really love to learn a little bit more from your perspective, right? Why should businesses, both inside and sort of outside the the European sort of region, start to be paying attention to the new European Accessibility Act?
Well, it's a very ambitious legislation in that it doesn't only cover companies that are headquartered in the EU, but actually anyone in kind of the whole value chain, manufacturers, distributors, importers, and service providers. So anyone that is doing business in the EU and who are selling the number of certain products and services in scope will be covered by this directive. And it doesn't really matter if you are from the US or somewhere else. If you are doing business in the EU, then this may apply to you. So therefore, I think it's important that people pay attention. And you said it is a regulation. That's not entirely true. It's a directive. We have different kinds of legislation at EU level, and a regulation is like GDPR, and that is a one-size-fits-all. So it's the same in every member state. A directive, which is both the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act, called an act, but it is a directive just to make things more easy for people. But that means that we have common laws, common requirements at EU level, but then it needs to be transposed into the member states. So that means that there are some differences in how the enforcement is made and also how the penalties are provided in the member states. So it's a little bit more tricky than a regulation.
Okay. And I'd love to sort of dig into that a little bit further, right? So, right, who does the sort of directive apply to in terms of the 28th of June? And what's that going to look like in terms of between the 28th of June and 2030, and what the changes are going to be?
So I think that on the 29th of June, we will all wake up and everything will be accessible, but maybe that's not happening. But so there is a long list of products and services that are in scope. So computers, smartphones, ebooks, e-readers, self-service terminals that are connected to some of the services. We have the banking, consumer banking, and e-commerce. So a lot of things, but everything that is connected to consumers. So it's not business to business, but business to consumer. That is important to remember. All of these, and also TV, broadcast and on-demand TV are covered. So anyone providing products and services within those specific sectors are covered by this. And then again, it doesn't matter if you are, if you are the economic operator, so no matter if you are producing it, developing it, designing it, or just providing it to the market, then you are still covered by this legislation. And there is a lot of discussions around the grace periods, but really the vast majority of economic operators are covered from this June. It's only if you have a service contract with the consumer that you have agreed before the 28th of June, then of course you can deliver that service after the law entered into place. But I don't know how many consumers have agreements or contracts with their service providers for 5 years, but there's a possibility to continue to deliver on that service contract for 5 years. And also if the service is using a product, so for example, say a streaming service that is using a TV, a set-top box or something similar, so a product that is used to deliver the service, then as long as the service is compliant, then the product, provided it was legal before this law entered into force, then you may continue to use that product for another 5 years, so until 2030. But those are very specific cases. And then there is an option for the member states if they would like to offer the opportunity for self-service terminals to be used until the end of their economic life, so not to throw them out when they are still well working. So if they were legal before the 28th of June, they can still be on the market for up to 20 years, as long as they are working. And there is also a grace period for emergency communication, also an opt-in or opt-out for member states, that they can offer a grace period until 2027 for the emergency services. So that is actually calling what is 112 in Europe, so 911 in the US. Those kind of emergency calls also need to be accessible, but because this has, we've had some problems with implementing real-time text and those things. So there is a possibility to have a grace period there as well, over 2 years. But I mean, these are very, very specific cases. All the consumer banking, all the ebooks, all the e-commerce, all the computers and all of that, they all need to comply on the 28th of June this year.
Okay. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really insightful, and I think a lot of stakeholders will find that really, really useful. I think I was keen to sort of get your perspective and sort of dig a little bit into, especially around sort of e-com businesses. All businesses are going to be ultimately covered, from the enterprise sort of through to sort of mid-market and SMBs. But obviously these businesses have a lot of different levels of resource and different levels of knowledge internally. Do you have any advice for businesses maybe on the smaller side of things, or how they should approach it compared to larger enterprises where they have, third-party agencies, big development resources? It's quite a sort of tangible difference. So I'm just curious from your perspective how you would think about that given the different sizes.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and according to, I don't have scientific proof of this, but I think the larger organizations are already quite well prepared, because they usually have a compliance officer or a whole legal team, so they have known about this for a long time. And we really see small and medium-sized companies and the smaller ones waking up to something that they have never heard about before. So it's definitely more challenging for them, I would say. So I think not panicking is a good thing, and starting to see what you can do for free if you don't have the resources. There's a lot of resources out there, especially if you're English speaking. So from W3C, and also the standards, European standards, are also free of charge. And you can also join the International Association of Accessibility Professionals to get the membership, to have a community to ask, and of course, involve users in everything you do. So I think there's a lot of things you can do to raise awareness and kind of try to raise your competence internally. And just starting somewhere, I think, is important, because you will not be able to fix everything if you are new to this. So try to make a list of things you need to do, and don't forget the processes. I think what I've seen during my years is that many companies, they do an audit or a test, and then they do training, and then they go, okay, bang, we did accessibility and now we're fine. And now next year we will do gender issues, or we will do something else. And that's not really how it works. I think all organizations who succeed with accessibility is kind of internalizing it, building it into their procedures or workflow. So I think that is an important thing, but that's easier said than done if you're not new to it and a small organization, of course. So I would say get a friend, get out there, get into LinkedIn or Slack, or places where people share knowledge, and try to meet with other people like-minded. There's a lot of good information out there. So I think it's not necessary to buy super expensive consultancy work from day one, at least. And then I need to say that micro enterprises that provide services, they are exempt from the legislation.
Fantastic. And look, I say to everyone I speak about accessibility, right? Accessibility is a journey. It's not a destination, right? It's all about sort of shifting left and really trying to embed accessibility from the ground up. So I think that's really interesting. So again, I'd love to get your sort of perspective in terms of, for those organizations that don't comply, what is the potential risk? What does that look like? And how is that going to vary, I guess, between the different member states?
It varies a lot. So the enforcement is made at national level. And that means that in every member state, 1 up to 10 or maybe even more competent authorities are selected by the member state to do the market surveillance. And that is usually pointed out in sectors. So if there is a financial surveillance authority already looking into banking and financial institutes, they will probably also do the surveillance of consumer banking for the EAA. And if you have a telecoms regulator, they will probably get the responsibility for the telecom part. So that is done in most of the member states. In some of the smaller ones, they have instead appointed the same agency as is doing the monitoring for the Web Accessibility Directive, or they have appointed 1 or maybe only 2, 1 for products and 1 for services. But in most countries, there are a handful of regulators that is going to do surveillance. And they're going to do proactive surveillance, really doing monitoring, and then also reacting to complaints. So, and there are a wide range of penalties, and that it works different in all different countries. This is where a directive is good for the member state, because they can write a law that's following their traditions and their history, and it's fits into their legal framework, which is positive. For an accessibility expert that needs to remember everything and in all different member states, or a big company that sells to all the member states, this becomes, oh my God, do I really need to know all of this? But of course, it's coordinated. It's not like you need to be in contact with 27 different regulators or 57 or something. That's not the case. If you are claiming disproportionate burden or fundamental alteration, you're supposed to let the competent authorities know on beforehand, and also keep the documentation. So if they ask for it, you have to have the assessment ready for them to look into. But I would say, instead of looking at how much can we, what's the penalty in Spain compared to Germany, may be interesting, but I mean, try not to be caught instead. I think that is better. And I would really recommend to be proactive and ask the regulator, because this may, to US people, this may sound like a joke, but they are there to help. The goal is not to fine and get people into jail and all of that. That is not the intention. The intention is for the competent authority to support the economic operators to become accessible if they are not accessible at this point. And they are not going to just put a fine on you from the first day. They are definitely going to first approach you, let you know what the problem is, give you a reasonable time frame to fix it, and so on and so forth. And I think the only people or the only organizations who need to be kind of scared of the penalties are the ones that do not care or do not listen. Because it's also in the act that the economic operators, they must collaborate with the regulators. So that is expected from you. If they ask you of something, or if they want to make contact, then you are supposed to talk to them. And if you do that, I think you can walk away in a nice way. And of course, you need to do some work, but it's only if you kind of don't want to hear this, that is when this is going to get really kind of bloody, I think. So
I think that's it. I think that's some really good advice, right? Especially about sort of reaching out to the operators. And ultimately, this is about progress. It's about making digital experiences, content and code accessible, and the web equal. So I think that's really good. I think, given your sort of vast background in the space, and, again, from sort of speaking to sort of various sort of customers or companies that are looking to get accessible, one thing that really comes up is really around, how do we become accessible, right? A lot of people are aware of WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as a concept, but obviously EAA doesn't enforce WCAG. It sort of references the poor as a concept. So I think, again, for someone like myself, it would be really good to really understand actually what are the key differences, and actually how companies can leverage that to approach e-compliance within the European Accessibility Act.
How many hours do I have?
Yeah.
So what we are currently doing in the standardization groups that are mandated by the Commission to create standards that support organizations is to update 3 existing European standards and create 3 new ones. So there will be 6 standards within the mandate, and then the EPUB standard is outside of that for ebooks. And we're also updating a technical report. So there are standards on hardware, on software, on packaging, on understandable information, on the self-service terminals, on the emergency. I mean, all these things it's so much more than web. I'm amazed that so many people from outside of the EU think that the European Accessibility Act has to do with websites. I mean, it's also included, but it's really, if you are selling the product or service in scope, then you have a long list of things that you need to comply to, and having an accessible website is one of them. It's not even the primary thing. So you need to really look outside of WCAG. WCAG is fine, and we will also reference WCAG 2.2, by the way, when the EN 301549 is updated. That is already decided, so you can be absolutely sure that WCAG 2.2 is kind of the web part of what you're doing. But already now, the European standard for ICT accessibility covers 60 more requirements than is referenced in WCAG for websites and apps. So even for your digital environments or digital services, WCAG will not be enough it will be substantial and good and important, but you will need to go beyond that. So you really need to start looking into the European standards if you want to comply. That said, the standards are voluntary. So in the EU, this is an important difference towards the US. So in the law, we say who is covered and what is covered. And in the European Accessibility Act, there is an annex, Annex 1, where all the requirements are listed. So those are the requirements that you actually need to comply with. You can comply in any way you like. The easier way is, of course, to use the standards for what is called presumed conformance. That means that the standards are harmonized and published in the European official journal of the European Union. And that means that if you follow those standards, then you can presume that you are compliant. That is easy. But if you would like to comply with the requirements in another way, you're welcome to do so. That is the way that the Commission is doing two things. One thing is that the standards keep moving, they keep evolving, and that's why we can be at 2.2, while part of the US legislation is pointing to 2.0 still. So standards are slow, but legislation is even slower. So that is why we have that in two different paths. And the other thing is that we open up for innovation. So if you don't find a good way of solving this in the standard, because technology evolves, obviously, then you can do it in another way, as long as you maximize the foreseeable use, you provide information with more than one sensory channel, and all of those kind of key issues in the Accessibility Act, then you can do it in another way. Because who knows what happens in a week? Somebody has invented something super cool with AI that none of us knows. And the standardization people cannot foresee everything that is happening in the next couple of years, obviously. So we are kind of standardizing the current situation, and that is why the EU is also keen on fostering innovation in a way that we open up for other ways of solving this. And I think that is sometimes it's making businesses crazy, but I think it's genuinely a good thing, and it's also based on the fact that this legislation is an inner market legislation. The reason this directive actually entered into force in 2019 was that it was moved from kind of the social inclusion parts of the policy production and into the inner market. So this legislation has entered into force because the EU wants to make sure that we can sell accessibility solutions across the market and beat the Americans. Well, that's not written anywhere, but that's always the the reason for this. But really, it is an inner market directive, and that I think is important. So it's not, the idea is not to make life problematic for companies, but rather to open up a bigger market and make sure that we share the solutions to end users with disabilities across all member states, and hopefully also then the prices will lower. Of course, that's the kind of the trickle down effect, hopefully longer along the road.
Amazing. And look, I think that's it's a really interesting point around innovation, and look, obviously, with the way that AI is moving and the way that technology is moving, I think it's brilliant that actually, their ability to sort of move alongside that and still be able to be compliant as technology develops. So I think that's really interesting. And one thing I was really curious, I guess, a little bit around that point to get a broader perspective on, and again, sometimes we see, I think, in the market that the companies are approaching accessibility as more of a one-off project. They want to be compliant with the deadline. Obviously, we know, accessibility is it's a journey. It's a journey, not a destination. How would you sort of approach that with organizations? How would you get them thinking around that sort of core point? And I guess sort of what are the broader benefits sort of long term for companies and accessibility?
Well, hopefully, having harmonized standards and the same laws and requirements all over EU will hopefully benefit organizations. And I think as long as the requirements are clear and everyone knows what to do, then I think that benefits. That's the idea of standards, at least, to also benefit industry. And now, at this particular point, I think EU is leading the way. And in a couple of years, it could be Asia or the US again. I mean, the US have been leading for many years, now a little bit behind. So I think, and I like that, because we are kind of helping each other, and one is in the lead and the other follows. And that way we keep evolving. So I think there are benefits. Obviously, I mean, what we always say, that being accessible means that you have your design in order. It's trustworthy. You get more clients and all of that. If you are not just interested in not being sued, then it's also the positive things. But I really find the key of this legislation very beautiful. I think there is a very nice way of putting it, and that is what is repeated several times in the Act, is to maximize the foreseeable use. And I think if I was a developer or a producer or a product or service, I would like to maximize the foreseeable use. Of course, I want everyone to be able to use my products. And with the aging population we have everywhere, but especially I think in Europe, we really see that in order to make sure that products and services can be used for as many as possible, I mean, accessibility and good UX are really, and kind of simplicity, understandability, ease of use, all of that is extremely important. Otherwise, we exclude not only people with disabilities, but a lot of users. And we see that really, I think, on the rise. People who we didn't see as being part of the kind of the vulnerable groups a couple of years ago, they are now completely overwhelmed by the technology, because there's too many PIN codes and too many passwords and too many updates all the time, and people really struggle to use the technology that should be there to help us. And I think accessibility is just the kind of the engine that everything evolves around. And then there's a lot of UX and other things that needs to happen around this as well to support the users. But I think if you turn it around and don't think this is something, we need to do this because it's a law and a stupid standard, technical, but really this is just making sense because we want more people to use the product. I think, to me, that has always been a much more useful argument than there's a legal requirement and somebody's going to hit you. Until now, I have never met somebody that jumps out of bed in the morning with a smile saying, today I'm not going to break the law. That's just not the driver for people. So you need to find another driver. And I've always found that the positive driver much more efficient. But that's also why I do not do business in the US, because things are completely different there. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think, for me personally, I mean, accessible content, code, accessible experiences are great for everyone. I think you mentioned, before, in terms of the aging population and the impact it has across the board. I know, when I go to restaurants sometimes and the menus are tiny, I'm sat there with the light shining on my iPhone. And I definitely take advantage these days of the ability to leverage some of these components. So I think that's, it's such a good point to highlight. So I think, what I'd really love to understand is I think what are some of the challenges you've seen in terms of, sort of being part of the sort of commission and sort of bringing it to this point? What are the biggest challenges you just see in terms of across the sort of broader market?
Lack of competence, I would say. There are not enough experts around, and IAAP tries to support that with training and certification. But I think an even bigger problem is that in the generic ICT companies, if you will, people who are not the experts, but who are delivering all the design and everything in ICT, the vast majority of them still get out of university with a degree in something, web professional something, never heard of accessibility. So we have both on the supply side and the demand side, honestly, also. I mean, so the buyers also don't know how to do this, and that we just need to fix it, and we haven't. And it breaks my heart every time we get new people who wants to do internships or things like that, and they come directly out of university or other education, and they just, they've had maybe an hour or maybe half a day about accessibility, and they know nothing. And as long as we continue doing that, this will just not fly. So I think that is the biggest issue we have. Definitely, it is something is definitely happening with this legislation. We see new companies popping up in all the markets, and a lot of people being certified, being trained, and so on. So it's absolutely happening, but it's happening on the expert side. And that means that we will continue first develop things that are not accessible, and then we, the experts, will come in and remediate. And that is such a kind of backwards way of doing things still in 2025. Why can't we do it right from the beginning? And that the law doesn't really make that happen. So what I would have liked to see would be that, like for websites, so the content management systems, that's where we should put the efforts, or the browsers. I mean, so much earlier on than when people start developing their websites and so on. So still think there's a lot to be done, but the lack of expertise is definitely the biggest challenge we have.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think accessibility is it's like a lift, right? We want to embed accessibility from the ground up. It's the first thing that should go into the design systems. It's yeah, I totally agree. So, look, thanks so much for joining today, Susanna. It's been great having you on. It's been great sort of leveraging some of your experience, and I think it's going to be really vital, some of the takeaways from today. So look, June 28th is just a few weeks away, but here's the good news. You still have a chance to get your digital content into compliance and reduce the potential risk for fines, negative feedback from users, or any potential penalties that are going to come with the new regulations. But look, you have to be proactive about it. So if you're ready to get started, you can use our free web accessibility scanner in the episode link today, or you can get in touch with us directly via the website. So thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
HearSay is produced by Mike Barton, Sojin Rink, and Missy Jensen. Edited by Alex Dorier. For more info on how to enhance your digital content's accessibility and easily meet compliance standards, visit AudioEye.com.